Today we're going to talk about Unit 5.7, Election and Secession. Our key questions today will be: how does slavery impact national party platforms and organization? What are the results of the election of 1860? What is secession? Why do Southerners do it? And how does Lincoln react? And what creates the conflict at Fort Sumter, and what are the results? By the time we get to 1860, the issues facing the United States are too divisive for a national party to be able to ignore, particularly over the slavery divide. Those issues we've talked about in the past, Bleeding Kansas, Uncle Tom's Cabin, raid on Harper's Ferry, have made it impossible for one national party or candidate to appeal to all regions of the United States. We've already seen the Whig Party disintegrate and be replaced by a regional party, the Republicans, in the 1856 election. Today we will see what happens to the Democrats. A key concern in this divide for the southern states is the idea of states' rights. Historically, the South has favored smaller federal government and stronger states. We see this when we talked about the anti-federalists, who were afraid the Constitution would give the federal government too much power, and Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who fought to keep states' rights, smaller government, limited government, strict interpretation of the Constitution, etc. Particularly, southern states are afraid that if the federal government is too strong, they will take away states' rights to slavery. You cannot separate slavery and states' rights completely, right? So even though the southern states are concerned about states' rights, they want those rights in order to protect slavery, along with other issues. The election of 1860 is a really funky election. It has four major candidates. Part of that is because the Democrats are going to split. At the Democratic Convention, right, the party will choose Stephen Douglas, who is from the North, and many of the Southern Democrats don't agree with this. They split off. They form their own Democratic Party of Southern Democrats, choosing John C. Breckinridge, who is an advocate for the expansion of slavery. We will also have a new party emerge in the 1860 election, the Constitutional Union Party, who wants to focus on the Constitution and maintaining the Union. This is particularly strong in the middle of the country, and they're the most moderate of your four party candidates. Then we have the Republicans. The Republican Party made its first presidential bid in the 1856 election. Its candidate in 1860 is a young up-and-comer, Abraham Lincoln. And the party has a platform of not expanding slavery, right? Not necessarily attacking it in the South, but not allowing it to spread. So, why is it impossible in the minds of Southerners to accept no expansion of slavery? Well, what happens if none of our new territories have slavery? When that territory is ready to become a state, it will get 2 senators. If every time we get new senators, they are from free states, eventually the South fears the Senate will overwhelmingly, 60-70%, be from free states, and then they will have all the power and the southern states will have no voice in the Senate. So, what are the results of the 1860 election? Lincoln will win. And if you look, you can see it's a very unique election. Lincoln will have by far the most popular vote. However, he only gets 40% of that. Less than half of Americans who voted for Abraham Lincoln. You can also see the regional divide and the decline of someone like Stephen Douglas, who, although he gets 29% of the popular vote, showing that he had some widespread support, he only got 4% of the electoral vote. So he got very little, he rarely won whole states. So let's look at this map and think about a couple key issues. Why do we think states like Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky would have gone with John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party? Well, if you look geographically, if the North and the South go to war with each other, A lot of that war would be fought along the border. These states would be most impacted, so they have the most vested in peace. How many southern states voted for Abraham Lincoln? As you can see, no southern states voted for Abraham Lincoln. And for many, he wasn't even on the ballot as an option. And that's going to be a key issue in moving the United States towards civil war. For Southerners, the election of Lincoln is the last straw. No southern states had voted for Lincoln. And so Southerners are upset that a person could win the highest office in our nation, the presidency, without the support of any southern states. And therefore, they feel like their voice is not being represented in the federal government. Secession means the act of leaving the Union, leaving the United States, no longer being a state within the United States. And in
Good afternoon, Wildcat.
Sorry for the interruption. In December of 1860, South Carolina's legislature met, held a convention, and voted unanimously for secession, or to leave the United States. Why? According to this convention, they wrote their Declaration of the Immediate Cause, which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. Their document declaring their independence and why. On the 4th of March next, a new administration will take possession of the government. It has announced that a war must be waged against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. The guarantees of the Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will have become their enemy. That is the words of South Carolina on why. The election of Lincoln saying he's going to come after slavery, which is debatable, right? He said he will prevent its expansion. And that no longer will they be considered equal states. They will have less power than northern states, and therefore the Constitution and their rights as states have been violated. And so by February, 7 of what we call Deep South states have seceded. Deep South: South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Here, these are the states most dependent on slavery financially and that have the most slaves. They have the most concern and most interest in keeping slavery in place. They will join together to create the Confederate States of America. They'll write a new constitution. And this government for the Confederate States will be a much weaker federal government and much stronger state government. Their constitution will guarantee the protection of slavery in the Confederacy, and they elect a president, Jefferson Davis. In the Senate, we will see a senator named John Crittenden make one last attempt at compromise. Note, he again is from one of those middle states that would be most impacted by the fighting. He proposes a constitutional amendment that would address both the issue of territorial expansion and the conflict over the fugitive slave law. To address the conflict over territorial expansion, Crittenden proposes we go back to the 3630 line. 1820, Henry Clay, it worked for a couple decades, let's go back to that. When it comes to the fugitive slave law, he offers for the federal government to pay slave owners for their runaway slaves, thus hoping to keep the Southerners happy that they got financial compensation and keeping Northerners happy because they don't have to contribute actively to slavery by returning runaways. This compromise does not pass the Senate, and it's a great example of how different a place we are from 1820, 1850, even 1854, and the idea of popular sovereignty. The ability to find the middle ground is no longer there. On top of the Senate's inability, we see President Buchanan, who feels like there's very little legally he can do to stop secession, so he mostly lets it proceed. Once Lincoln becomes president, he is sworn in and gives an inauguration speech, his first inaugural, where he publicly states he has no interest in going after slavery where it currently exists. He just doesn't believe it should expand. At the same time, however, he denies that states have the legal right to leave the United States. Lincoln doesn't and never will acknowledge that Southern states are no longer part of the United States. He sees them as states in rebellion, not a separate nation. The final step in leading to military conflict of the Civil War is Fort Sumter. If you look on our map, Fort Sumter is a U.S. fort located in the middle of Charleston Harbor. It guards the port of Charleston, which is the key harbor in the South, politically, militarily, debatably, economically. So it's really important to the state of South Carolina and to the South as a whole. When Southern states seceded, they started taking the federal forts in their own land. Remember, all of this in pink, South Carolina now claims to no longer be part of the United States. They don't want U.S. military forts all around in their country, in their new nation. And so the states, like South Carolina, think these are their property. The United States says no, they're still U.S. military installations. The Confederacy will demand the troops surrender. The troops refuse. Shots are fired. And the fort will relatively quickly run out of ammunition and surrender. Within days, Lincoln will declare the South in insurrection or rebellion and call for 75,000 troops to begin preparing for a more substantial fight over secession. After Fort Sumter, right, 4 more southern states, right, the northern slave states, will secede. Note, remember, our deep South states secede on the election of Lincoln. These top, more northern slave states here, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, will secede only after Fort Sumter, after it's clear this is going to be a military conflict. So by the time we get to summer of 1861, our lines are clearly drawn. The Confederate States of America has been formed, and we are heading toward a military conflict.